In today's episode of the Healthy Christian Leader podcast, Danny Smith introduces the theme from our 2017 season of Leadership Talks, centering around grace and truth. He lays out a foundation for the subject that will be built upon in later episodes from season 3. And Danny takes time to point out two major ditches that Christians are in danger of falling into: grace without truth or truth without grace, both of which lead us away from the gospel. The answer is to model our lives after Jesus, and Danny shows different examples of how Jesus modeled grace and truth throughout the four Gospels. This talk brings a much-needed reminder for Christian leaders in our day and age. We pray it encourages you.
Well, good morning and welcome to The Well. It's my privilege to greet you at the start of a new ministry season for the Aaron Ministries Network. And I especially want to welcome this morning everyone who is at one of our wells for the first time. My prayer is that you find the well a place where you are encouraged, focused, and equipped for the unique call that God has placed on your life as a Christian leader. Here at Aaron Ministries, our goal is to journey with Christian leaders towards greater wholeness and health in their lives. The vision of Aaron Ministries is to see throughout Atlantic Canada healthy leaders leading healthy churches that transform communities with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the vision that God gave our president of Aaron Ministries, Dwight Habermel, many years ago, and it's the DNA of who we are and why we do what we do. With this talk this morning, I'm going to introduce our theme for the coming year, which is grace and truth. Each of the Well Talks this ministry year will in some way shine some further light on this theme. And this morning, all I want to do is to lay a foundation that others will build upon throughout the year. It's my conviction that this theme of grace and truth is a very timely and necessary one for our day that we need to think deeply about and wrestle with together. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that we live in a time where seismic shifts are taking place not only in our society and world, but in the church as well. This spring, I was invited back to my home field of churches to speak at their annual youth rally. Now, this was done, mind you, with much fear and trepidation because it's probably been at least 10 to 15 years since I had spoken at a youth event. And as I was preparing the messages for that weekend, it dawned on me that it was exactly 20 years ago this past spring in 1997 that I graduated from that youth group. And that thought led me down the path of asking myself, what's different for these teens from when I was in youth group 20 years ago? And the answer is a whole lot. The massive cultural, social, technological, economic, and political changes that have taken place in just those 20 years are astounding. As a way to introduce my first talk at this event, I shared with the group just how vastly the world I grew up in and the one they're growing up in really are. This is how I began my introductory talk to them. I said, I don't feel old at 37. But the world you're growing up in is much different than the world that I grew up in. Up until I was 16 and we got our first IBM computer with dial-up internet, I typed all my school assignments on a typewriter. Google was a set of old encyclopedias on the shelf in our home. Star Wars still only had 3 episodes, and the song Macarena and the dance that went with it was still cool. I listened to music on a Walkman and then a portable CD player that if you jiggled it just a little too much, it would skip and mess up the song. Portable MP3 players were not yet invented and MP3s were not yet mainstream. Most of us still had a phone attached to a cord hanging on the wall, and if someone had a cell phone, it was in a bag on the floor of their car. Whereas today, my whole life is stored on the phone in my pocket. The first Harry Potter book was still being written out on napkins and banged out on an old typewriter by single mom J.K. Rowling, who didn't have a cent to her name. Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, was still working as a camp counselor in Algonquin Park in Ontario. And Donald Trump wasn't even a reality TV star, let alone President of the United States. In fact, reality TV didn't exist. That premiered 3 summers after I graduated from high school with Survivor Season 1. Facebook didn't exist either, neither did Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, text messaging. In fact, social media didn't exist. Right now, you can use a printer to print a gun, car parts, a home, replacement parts for toys. In the not-so-distant future, you'll be able to print organs and other body parts as well. When I was a teen, our printers were dot matrix, and some of you don't even know what that is. For all of you, 9/11 and the reality of recurring acts of terror are a fact of life, but 9/11 was still a number of years in the future for me. Columbine and all the school shootings that followed hadn't happened yet. In youth group, when it was time for the sex talk, it was quite simple. Abstinence until marriage was encouraged. Things such as same-sex marriage, bisexual, transgender weren't even on the radar. 20 years. What's 20 years? That's not a long time. But needless to say, things in 20 years have changed drastically, and you teens are living right in the middle of it all. It used to be that human knowledge would double about every century. After World War II, it's about every 25 years. Right now, it doubles about every 13 months, and it's predicted that very soon, with increased computer and internet speeds, that human knowledge will double every 12 hours. Well, folks, at the well this morning, as I looked back on just that short span of time, it was amazing to me the massive amount of change that's occurred. I used to think that the world that my parents grew up in and the one that I grew up in were different, and in some respects they were. But there was a lot of continuity between those two worlds. But as I think about the world that I grew up in and the one my kids are growing up in some ways it's like we're growing up on two different planets. And as the church, we don't live in isolation from the world around us, as we're left swimming in this sea of rapid change like everyone else. And my observation, well, not just my observation, but the observation of many people within the church, is that the church is struggling in the midst of all this to find its place in the world. I know many days as a leader in the church that I struggle, that I feel confused and inadequate to lead God's people through the midst of this sea of change, as I'm sure that many of us today do as well. The old paradigms are being torn down so rapidly, and just when we think that we've got a handle on the new paradigm that's been erected to take the place of the old one, the new one is torn down and replaced by something altogether new and different. Something else I've observed as I've watched the church and been a part of the church since my days in diapers is that as the church tries to find its way in this world and tries to be the church that God is calling her to be for this day, for this time, I've noted that the church seems to oscillate between two different kinds of responses as she tries to navigate how to live out its presence and mission as Christ Church in this world. And this is where a theme for the year of grace and truth come in. Because I've watched as some churches, some Christians, first of all, they lean hard towards the side of grace at the expense of truth. They believe that they're most faithfully and most obediently being God's people in this world by simply showing grace. And they believe that in order to do that, that all judgment, all talk of sin and righteousness and holiness and so on must go, or at least be severely downplayed. These topics have no place in our conversations, our songs, our sermons, our life together as the church. The role of the church, for what we'll call the gracers, is not only to embrace everyone where they're at, no matter who they are, but also to never challenge them to change, because God loves everyone just the way they are. The Lady Gaga song Born This Way might well be the Gracer theme song. Some of the lyrics go like this. My mama told me when I was young, we're all born superstars. She rolled my hair and put my lipstick on in the glass of her boudoir. There's nothing wrong with loving who you are, she said, 'cause he made you perfect, babe. So hold your head up, girl, and you'll go far. Listen to me when I say, I'm beautiful in my way, 'cause God makes no mistakes. I'm on the right track. Baby, I was born this way. The problem is that grace without truth is not truly grace, as we'll discover in a few moments. And it's definitely not gospel, because at the heart of the message of the gospel is this notion that we're all sinners estranged from God by our sin. And that's why we're in such desperate need for grace in the first place. And there's a word that describes very well what grace devoid of truth is. We call it relativism. And it's the murky soup of everything goes that we currently find ourselves swimming in this cultural moment here in Canada. Truth, what is right, really right, is now playing second fiddle, or maybe even fourth or fifth, to the much more important question of our day. How does it make me feel? Does it make me happy? Does it feel good? Then it must be right. And far too often the church is more than happy to play along, pitching truth out the window so that it can snuggle up nice and cozy with the moral relativism of the day. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, we have those churches and Christians who choose a very different response to being the church in our day. They believe that they are being most faithful and most obediently following God by leaning hard towards truth at the expense of grace. They seem to believe that if you rail and rage long enough and loud enough against the moral corruption in our culture, that this is what's needed to turn things around. What people need most is the hard hammer of truth to turn them back to God. And we'll call these folks truthers, gracers and truthers. Often these folks are seen retreating from engagement with the world around them and retreating to their own Christian ghettos where everyone thinks the same, believes the same, acts the same, dresses the same. They see themselves as final bastions of truth in a world going to hell in a handbasket, and they're happy to let everyone else know it. But the problem, though, with truth without grace is that it's not the gospel either. At the heart of the gospel is the announcement that God accepts sinners not on the basis of observing the law, but by his grace. And the way we maintain that relationship is not by being good people, but that too is an act of grace. And just as we've been shown grace by God, we're called to emulate him and show grace to others. Just like grace without truth is not really grace, but relativism, so truth without grace is not really truth, but instead legalism. Now, we need to be honest with ourselves today, because very likely each of us gravitates towards one or the other of these, grace and truth. So just take a moment right where you're at and ask yourself, when I think about the best way of being a follower of Jesus in this cultural moment, am I more of a gracer or a truther? Do I shy away from speaking truth in favor of showing grace? Or do I find myself speaking truth or acting with a sense of truth without much grace to it? What's your more natural inclination? You know, there's a big problem with this dichotomy we sometimes see expressed in the church between grace and truth. And it's that neither one of them on their own are able to fully express the gospel, and neither one on its own leads us to faithfully follow Jesus as disciples in this world. Jesus was neither a gracer or a truther. His life followed a third and different path that we read about in John 1, verse 14. And this verse will be our theme verse for the year. Let me read it for you. It says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Most of us are very familiar with this verse. I would guess that hardly a Christmas season goes by that many of us at some point don't end up returning to it again. The problem is, often when we turn to this verse, we're so focused on the first part of the verse, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, that the end of the verse often gets ignored. But the last 5 words of this verse are crucial for us in understanding how it is that Jesus, the Word, came and made his dwelling among us. Or as the phrase literally reads, how he came and pitched his tent among us. What was the nature or the essence of this dwelling among us? What did it look like? With what demeanor did Jesus come? How did Jesus conduct himself as he lived on this earth? These are important questions for people who consider themselves followers of Jesus. If we want to follow him, if we want to emulate his nature, then we need some picture, some indication of what this looked like. Now, the simplest answer to these questions that I've asked of the life of Jesus, the life he lived on this earth, is love. I mean, that's the Sunday school answer, isn't it? The essence of who Jesus is was that he is love. He lived a life consumed by love. God is love, and the love of the Father is made manifest in Jesus the Son. But the problem is that this one-word answer, love, leaves itself wide open to interpretation. Loving like Jesus loved easily becomes loving like I want to love. Both the legalist with the megaphone peeking out from his Christian ghetto and the relativist who refuses to call anything sin or even acknowledge that sin exists can and do make the claim that they are loving like Jesus loved. That's why I'm thankful for John here, who's a little more specific, right here at the beginning of his gospel, concerning the way in which Jesus came among us and actually lived out a life of love. John defines for us, right here in verse 14, what Jesus' love actually looks like. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus' life was one full of grace and truth. Now, the word "and" is a very important word here for us. What John is trying to communicate to us is that Jesus was fully both of these things. Fully full of grace and fully full of truth. 100% both. Jesus avoided the twin ditches on both sides of the road of relativism and legalism, and demonstrates for us through his life what it really means for us to love others. To truly love someone is first to approach them with grace. I mean, how can we do anything but that? 1 John 4, verse 9 says, we love because he first loved us. We who have tasted and seen that the Lord is good, who have experienced God's forgiving grace to us, the guilty, who went so far to give up his Son for the sake of our sin, how can we not also show grace even to the worst of sinners? But true love is also truthful. When I see my children beginning to incorporate certain behaviors into their lives that would not be conducive to honoring God or thriving in life, the loving thing for me to do is not just to allow the behavior to continue because I'm a grace-filled parent, but being a grace-filled parent means that I will in love speak truth to them about what I see. Full of grace and truth. This is the very nature of God. God, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. This God of grace does not shy away from speaking truth to us in his word, does he? There's a very clear standard that emerges of the life of holiness and righteousness that he calls us to. I mean, God even has the nerve to call us sinners, if you can believe it. But his love compels him to do so. So Jesus, as the visible image of the Father, came full of grace and truth. Fully grace, fully truth. And as you can imagine for Jesus, loving people this way was just plain messy. It wasn't neat and tidy. It made people mad. It ticked them off and made them uncomfortable. Some people thought that he should have exercised more truth, should have been more legalistic, and others thought he needed to lean harder towards grace and be more relativistic. But Jesus, we see over and over, embraced this messy middle of grace and truth, even when it hurt. Even when it cost him friends and followers and donations, even when it cost him his life. I want us to then look briefly now at 4 times in the Gospels when Jesus demonstrated for us what it means to be full of grace and truth. The whole New Testament is one big object lesson of what that looks like, but I want us to zero in on 4 case studies to see what lessons we can learn from Jesus, our Master, on living life in the messy middle. Because this is where Jesus calls us to come and pitch our tent as well, and live next door to him in the messy middle of this intersection between grace and truth. The first case study happens in Samaria. Jesus and his disciples are traveling through Samaria from Jerusalem on their way to Galilee. And they come to the town of Sychar. And Jesus' disciples go to the town to buy food, and Jesus sits down by a well to rest while they're gone. It's noon, and while he's sitting there, a woman from the town comes to draw water. Now, most of us are familiar enough with the story to know that drawing water during the hottest time of the day was not common, and that this woman had something to hide, and that she simply wants to avoid people. And yet, there at this well is Jesus. A man, a Jew, a rabbi, someone who the moment he saw her should have gotten up and ran in the opposite direction. But Jesus doesn't. He engages her in conversation, an expression of grace. And his conversation with her is very intriguing. Jesus is somewhat cryptic as he talks with her about living water, but because we know the story, we know where he's going to go with it. He's using his words to point the woman to himself and how he can truly only satisfy her deepest thirst. All very good. All words of grace and hope. Except in verse 16, Jesus does something unexpected. Jesus says to the woman, "Go, call your husband and come back." Now, Jesus knows full well her less than stellar sexual history. So why is he messing up this perfectly good evangelistic opportunity by talking about this woman's sex life? Leave it alone, Jesus, we might be tempted to say. We can deal with that some other time. Get her into the kingdom first, and then sometime later that issue can be brought up, or maybe we won't even bring it up at all. If it's that important to God, let the Holy Spirit work in her heart and deal with it. It's none of our business. Well, the woman dodges the question. Her response to Jesus is, "I have no husband." Well, that's good enough for me. Isn't that what we'd say? Nothing to see here. We just need new members. No need to pry or look too deeply. But much to our chagrin, Jesus keeps going. Jesus says to her, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." Well, now Jesus has just gone and blown it, hasn't he? How is this conducive to effective evangelism? Forget the husbands, Jesus. I mean, you almost had her, and you could have sealed the deal. Why bring it up? But we know how the story ends. Jesus' disciples return. They're shocked that Jesus is here talking to this woman. The woman returns to town, obviously a changed woman because she tells the whole town about Jesus. And most shockingly is the fact that this woman tells us in the narrative that it's because Jesus raises the issue of her past sin that seals the deal for her in accepting him. Well, this is a messy and confusing story. Jesus shows grace where many in his culture, including his disciples, would have stayed far away. And he injects truth in a way that would have many of us saying, "Just shut up, Jesus, and seal the deal." This is the time for grace, not truth. We can deal with her past some other time. It's a frustrating story for both truthers and gracers. So what does Jesus want us to learn from this? I think one of the lessons that we can learn from Jesus here is that it's grace that creates the atmosphere for truth. Jesus' approach to this marginalized, sin-sick woman is grace, through and through. But grace, I want us to notice here, does not prevent Jesus from speaking truth. It, in fact, compels him to do so. In fact, speaking truth for Jesus is an integral part of showing her grace. But I also want us to note that it's in the context of a relationship of grace that truth is spoken. Jesus isn't on the megaphone here shouting biblical truth from a distance. He has entered into the life of this woman. He's formed a relationship with her, and it's in the context of this relationship of grace that truth is able to come. Ed Mason, who pastors the church in Philadelphia, says in an article that he wrote for Christianity Today magazine, he says, "Grace creates an environment for truth to be heard and either accepted or rejected." I think Jesus would agree with Ed here. Well, the second episode in Jesus' life I want us to focus on is also familiar to many of us. It's the story of the woman who's caught in adultery. And I realize that the authenticity of this story is sometimes called into question. But it seems to be very much in line with who we know Jesus to be and how Jesus would have acted. The details of the story are this. A woman has been caught in adultery, and nothing is said of the man involved. Such was the vast chasm between the treatment of men and women at the time. Under the law of Moses, she was to be stoned, although in Jesus' day this was a rarity. But a zealous group of religious leaders believe her to be the ideal candidate for the letter of the law on this day. It seems they envision her to be the perfect way to test Jesus' faithfulness to the law. Surely if Jesus, was who he said he was, then he would be more than happy to throw the first stone. But Jesus surprises them and offends them with grace. He places himself between the woman and the crowd ready to stone her. He scribbles a few things with his finger in the sand that we're not privy to and invites the person there who's without sin to throw the first stone. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The truthers are, of course, ticked off and offended, but they have no reply and walk away. But Jesus is an equal opportunity offender. And just when we think the episode is over, and what we have here is a marvelous picture of grace that meshes nicely with the turn a blind eye to sin, moral relativism of our day, Jesus injects a heaping helping of truth into the situation. After telling the woman that he doesn't condemn her, he tells her to now go and leave your life of sin. Now, the gracers, the moral relativist blood is boiling. How dare Jesus speak to her this way? It's amazing to me how often this story is paraded out as an object lesson for loving people just the way they are and not ever raising the issue of sin. Jesus' grace and compassion and defense of this woman is held up for us to admire, and so we should. But rarely do I find Jesus' final words to this woman held up with the same equal reverence and awe. But we shouldn't forget that both phrases, neither do I condemn you, and go and leave your life of sin, are found coming out of Jesus' mouth in the same piece of dialogue. I think the second lesson, then, that Jesus has for us here is that being full of grace and truth means, first of all, standing alongside those caught in oppressive situations, even if they're in that situation because of their own sin. But it also means pointing the way forward towards a life of freedom from sin in Christ, instead of leaving them stuck in the circumstances that we found them in with no direction as to how to escape. It's both coming alongside in grace, but also truthfully pointing towards a better way of new life in Jesus. The third incident I wanted just to draw our attention to is recorded in a number of the Gospels. And it involves Jesus' conversation with a man known only as the rich young ruler. And this man runs up to Jesus desperate for the answer to the question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Through his conversation with the man, Jesus finds out that this is a very devout young man who is zealous to obey the law. I mean, this guy is prime church member material. He's already a good, clean, living guy. All he needs to do is come to faith in Jesus. The fish is already mostly cleaned up, so to speak. And what a catch. He's practically begging to come to faith. And he's rich to boot. My goodness, let's get him into church and baptized quick. I mean, think of the size of those checks in the offering plate. And besides, in no time at all, he'll be the prime candidate to lead the finance board. Hopefully Jesus goes easy on this guy. Hopefully he plays softball with him to get him in. We wouldn't want to offend or lose this guy, would we? And it looks promising. Mark tells us in his gospel that looking at him, Jesus felt love for him. Grace is in the room, poised to win one for God. But then Jesus does the stupidest thing. Well, at least in our way of thinking, he does. He says to the man, one thing you lack. Go and sell all you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me. Now imagine a rich guy walked into your church, and one of the members of your church had the nerve to walk up to tell him that if he wanted to follow Jesus, he had to first go and sell everything that he had. While you'd have that church member back and taking Evangelism 101 just as quick as that rich guy walked out your door, never to return. I mean, of all the ridiculous things to say when someone is on the brink of coming to faith. And Jesus does lose the guy. I mean, this is not a happy ending story like the woman at the well. We read, but at these words he was saddened, and he went away grieving, for he was one that owned much property. So what is Jesus up to here? Has Jesus messed it up this time? Was he too full of truth with not enough grace in this circumstance? I don't think so. Jesus knew the heart of this man, and he knew that his great riches would always hold the place of primacy in his life, and that this man would always be held in bondage by his wealth as long as it was there, and that he would end up missing the riches of God's kingdom unless the wealth is gone from this man's life. And so I think a third thing that Jesus teaches us here is that full of grace and truth means that compelled by love, we have the courage to identify barriers that stand in the way of a person's relationship with God. In this case, grace, compassion, love for this man was seeking to help him see what stood in the way of him coming into relationship with God and inheriting the riches and privileges of God's kingdom as one of his children. And this one is beyond hard for many of us, and sometimes it means the loss of a relationship. At the end of the day, the man walked away. I know that this one is hard for me, that I can be a relationship at all costs kind of person. If I'm not careful, I can find myself downplaying or finessing truth or avoiding it altogether in order to preserve a relationship. But doing so is not grace. It's cowardice, because I don't want to be uncomfortable. Being full of grace and truth means at times speaking the truth with love. Well, finally, I want us to think about Peter. And I want us to think about Peter's betrayal of Jesus. Emulating Jesus full of grace and truth, I think for many of us, becomes the hardest when dealing with someone's sin and its consequences when we are the ones that it's directed towards. In such cases, we want the full hammer of truth and justice to come crashing down. We want somebody to pay. Peter, when Jesus needed him the most, threw him under the bus. So it's interesting to observe Peter and Jesus at the end of John's Gospel as Jesus meets his disciples in Galilee after they've been out for a night of fishing. How will Jesus respond to Peter? With bitterness and resentment? With harsh words? With a refusal of fellowship? Nope, none of these, but with grace and truth. There is truth as Jesus tests Peter's love and commitment to him by asking him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? The conversation is an uncomfortable one for Peter. He knows he's being tested by Jesus, but it's a conversation infused with grace. Jesus' response to Peter's affirmative answer to Jesus' thrice asked question is feed my lambs, take care of my sheep. Jesus is reinstating Peter. But not only does he reinstate him, he places him at the head of his merry band of disciples who he'll send out to flip the world upside down and right side up. Grace and truth, full up to the brim. And so finally, Jesus teaches us here then that full of grace and truth means holding people accountable for sin, yes, by all means. But it also means restoration, forgiveness, and second chances are the currency of our life together. This messy middle where grace and truth reside. It's a place, folks, of difficult conversations. It's a place of standing beside those the world and maybe even the church has turned its back on. It's a place of staying silent when we'd rather speak and speaking when we'd rather stay silent. It's a place of risk where relationships can be won. Think of Jesus and the woman at the well. Or lost. Think of Jesus and the rich young ruler. Is it any wonder that so often we'd rather just pitch our tent with the gracers or truthers instead of try and negotiate life in the messy middle full of grace and truth? It's a place fraught with pitfalls and challenges and wrong roads and falling down and getting back up. And yet, it's when we pitch our tent here and resolve to live in the tension between truth and grace that we most emulate Jesus. It's a tension that we need to learn to live in and live with. Pastor Andy Stanley, in his sermon on this text called When Gracie Met Truthy, he reminds us that it's important to let this tension be and not to try and resolve it, because in trying to resolve it, we lose something very, very important. But we want to resolve it, because to live like Jesus lived, full of grace and truth, is messy. Sometimes it appears inconsistent, and I can guarantee you it will land you in hot water, because there are those who in one situation will think that you should have exercised more truth, while in a different situation there will be others who think that you should have exercised more grace. If you want life to be easy, then go live in the gracer camp or go live in the truther camp, and you'll find lots of people in both willing to cheer you on. And you won't ever have to deal with living with the tension that this messy middle of truth, grace and truth brings into our lives. But know this, that it's here in the messy middle, not in the two ditches on either side, where we truly encounter Jesus and learn what it means, what it really means to be one of his disciples, full of grace and truth. Well, we're going to discover together throughout this year more of what this looks like. But I want us to start the discussion this morning in our small groups. And so, as you go to your groups, may God bless you and keep you in the messy middle as you live full of grace and truth. Amen.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Healthy Christian Leader podcast. If you enjoyed it, consider leaving a review for us on iTunes. Or if you're looking to grow with like-minded Christian leaders, engage with us on our online community. You can check out our website at aaronministries.com, or you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And of course, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Thanks. We'll see you next time.